Good afternoon and good evening, and welcome to today's meeting. My name is Vijay Mehta. I'm the chair of Uniting for Peace, board member of GAMIP. GAMIP stands for Global Alliance for Ministries and Infrastructure for Peace, and author of How Not to Go to War, establishing peace centers. Can you hear me all? Okay. Okay. Peace centers and ministries for peace worldwide. To say this, that if any of you here like to a complimentary copy of my book, How Not to Go to War, I'll be too happy to send you. All you need is to send me an email with your name and address. Allow me to say a few words about our organization, Uniting for Peace. Working over 43 years since 1979, Uniting for Peace is a non-profit organization devoted to creating and promoting a global culture of peace, non-violent alternatives to ending war, poverty reduction, and sustainable development. Among its core aims is establishing ministries and departments for peace by lobbying and influencing parliamentarians, legislators for abolishing war, militarism, arms trade, weapons, including nuclear and conventional weapons. And the savings thus we achieve to be deployed for the reduction of the armaments used for promoting culture of peace and non-violence. Dear friends, I'm going to start my presentation now about the escalating war in Ukraine or in Europe. The invasion of Europe by Russia is to be condemned in the strongest terms, as there is no such thing as a good war or a just war. It's all bloodshed, carnage, suffering of people, innocent people, like we are having in Ukraine and UK. My own country where I live is complicit in supplying weapons and intelligence to Ukraine. So it continues the war, more suffering for its citizens. Rand Corporation think tank outlines plans for USA to balkanize the Russian Federation, saying for USA to balkanize the Russian Federation, neutralize Moscow and encircle China. If one is thinking of starting World War III.
Can you get everyone to mute, please, Vijay? Can you get everyone to mute? We can't hear you clearly. There's people who've got their mics that are not muted. Can everybody mute, please?
Paul, you are the co-host. Can you see to it, please?
No.
Let me start by saying Rand Corporation think tank outlines plans for US.
Okay, you have to unmute, Vijay. I've muted everybody. You have to unmute. Just a sec, I'll do that for you. Yeah, you have to unmute.
Done? Okay, can
Done.
you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, so let me start again. Rand Corporation think tank outlines plans for USA to balkanize the Russian Federation, neutralize Moscow, and encircle China. If one is thinking of starting World War III, then one could not come up with a better idea. The planned enlargement of NATO eastwards and to accept Finland and Sweden as NATO members proves that NATO is a vast military pact of expansionist nature, and all the promises made by West to Russia of not going eastward expansion are nothing but a pack of lies. NATO, my friends, has announced the Madrid conference that it is going to bolster its defense from 40,000 to 300,000 troops to deter Russia from invading other countries and China from invading and capturing Taiwan. The increase in arms budget and sending troops by NATO countries can only escalate war, loss of life, and that makes NATO one of the most dangerous military alliance in the world. Dear friends, Ukraine conflict is nothing more than a propaganda war intended to weaken Russia and China. And because they are the new enemies, and in the pursuit of the hegemony and control of its dwindling power and its crumbling empire. It is the old US hero villain narrative for calls to arms rhetoric, dividing the world into goodies and baddies, and generating public support, especially in USA, for action and selling armaments. There is a major difference, friends, between US resource wars of Iraq, Syria and Afghanistan, and the present war in Russia and Ukraine. There has been hardly any opposition in Middle East countries as US could prevail in all those situations occupying a foreign territory. However, the difference of Russia and Ukraine war is Russia is a nuclear armed country with massive firepower, which is quite hard, if not impossible, to defeat. So, dear friends, a proxy war is going around between NATO and frontal war between Ukraine and Russia. The main intention of NATO is to prolong war, weaken Russia by supplying Ukraine with money, troops, and military hardware, a perfect scenario to turn a regional war into Third World War. The longer the war continues, the danger is that the line will be crossed to a direct war between Russia and the United States, which is becoming inevitable. Dear friends, as described in my 2016 book, Peace Beyond Borders, after 75 years of relative peace in Europe and 7 decades of European integration, driven by quest for peace in Europe, we are in the midst of war with which no sign of ending soon. And EU is sending heavy weapons and considering a nuclear option. There are many explanations as to why Europe's peace project has turned into a war project. NATO's expansion eastwards is source of Russian entanglement, conflict between Russia and the West. It's a feeling of betrayal and Russian fears of encirclement. NATO is a serious threat to world peace since its creation in 1949, having left a trail of destruction from Libya, Yugoslavia, and to Afghanistan. It's a war alliance, a part of the US military-industrial complex, intensifying global conflict for the gain of weapon manufacturers and war profiteers. We need to defund war and disband NATO, as only Warsaw Pact was dissolved. Dear friends, there is a difference between this war and other wars, and why? That is why Asia, Africa, and Middle East not supporting the Western war. Why? Because they see the apparent conflict that while in COVID, all the countries of the world cooperated and were on the same page, countries of Asia, Africa, and Middle East are not supporting the Western war, not buying into their propaganda, and have not imposed any sanctions on Russia, and are doing trading as usual. They see the apparent hypocrisy and double standards at play, as Western countries are behaving differently in supporting war in Ukraine, but not elsewhere. That is, in Palestine, in Syria, in Iraq, and Venezuela, not condemning war aggression by US and its dictatorial regime, changing policies in Latin America. Let us not forget something from history. Russians have done so much in so many ways at so many levels. We live in a free and independent society because of the sacrifices of Russians during the Second World War. So it's only sensible to stop military responses and have ceasefire and normalize the relations between Russia, Ukraine, and the West. Otherwise, continuing the war will have devastating consequences and may lead to nuclear options or World War III. So the only way, dear friends, is dialogue and peaceful means for the settlement of the conflict. Dear friends, sooner or later, war will end and Russian forces will retreat back to Russia, and peace will prevail between Russia and Ukraine. It is a folly of the US and the West to think that by supplying weapons to Ukraine, West can force Russia into submission. Trying to win or humiliate Russia, a nation as large as Russia, by force or arms is not only dangerous, but also delusional. It's up to all of us in the peace movement to formulate strategies to make sure that never come to pass. Peaceful dialogue with Russia is not appeasement, and portraying Russia as evil and dehumanizing is not helpful. Students of history know that the destruction, killing, and suffering of World War II, with over 85 million people died in recent history, is not a distant memory. In no circumstances it should happen again, and a World War III starts, as there is enough blood and carnage already going on in Ukraine. Dear friends, we cannot achieve peace through supplying heavy weapons, as it heightens the risk of World War III. And it is also detrimental to the populations of the people who are increasing military spending, which they could spend in health, education, jobs. And it's not justified, especially at this moment, as we are going through midst of fuel crisis, widespread hunger throughout the world, as the current food crisis demonstrates. Dear friends, my book, published in 2019, How Not to Go to War, proposes an alternative and radical solution to end war, which is by establishing ministries, departments for peace and peace centers in all countries of the world, promoting culture of peace and non-violent solutions for domestic and international conflicts by addressing and underlining root causes of violence in society and alternative peace strategies. The long-term objective of the peace movement is dissolving NATO, to work towards dissolving NATO and replacing it with collective security system based on dialogue, diplomacy, disarmament, and cooperation. There cannot be any peace in Europe unless we have peace with Russia and bring them as part of international community. Dear friends, we need to work towards ending culture of militarism and war in Ukraine. Departments for peace or institutions for peace will institutionalize peace in the same way that war has been institutionalized by Department of Defense or Department of War. As John F. Kennedy said in his address to the United Nations in 1961, mankind must put an end to war, or war will put an end to mankind. Thank you very much. Just
Very good, Vijay.
before I introduce the next speaker, I just to say that anyone like to have my speech, I could send them over on my computer, and the same is a request to all the speakers to send their speeches to us, because we are putting a report and speeches of this conference in our next newsletter, which is going to be published in September. So let me introduce our next speaker. David Swanson, a leading US activist, executive director of World Beyond War, and author of War is a Lie. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome David Swanson.
Thank you, Vijay, very much. Let me know if you can hear me. I'm going to try to share screen. Host disabled participant screen sharing, so I won't be sharing screen unless someone can change that. So imagine you're seeing stunning images that accompany these words and amplify their meaning tenfold and shock and amaze. About Ukraine, the death and suffering in Ukraine does not yet remotely compare with that.
David, can you speak a bit louder, David?
I can try to. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I cannot share screen. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yeah, you can share a screen. Yeah,
you can be made a co-host.
Well,
And
of course I could, but I'd have to be the host to make myself a co-host.
well, the host could make you a co-host. That's what I'm
I can
saying.
make you a
Yes.
co-host if I can find your name here. Can't find your name here. Oh yeah, I've got it. Yeah, you are a co-host now, David.
So I'm going to try to share screen. Let me know if you can hear me or if you can't hear me, and if you can see the PowerPoint or you can't see the PowerPoint. Let me go to the next slide. The death and suffering in Ukraine does not yet remotely compare with that in Yemen, nor does the death and suffering from war in Yemen yet compare with that around the world, resulting from the misdirection of resources into war, not to mention the impediments to urgently needed global cooperation created by war. When we talk about Ukraine, not only because it's in corporate media and involves relatively wealthy weapons dealing European nations waging war at home instead of in distant lands, but also because it has created the greatest risk of nuclear apocalypse yet seen on Earth. There are other possible flashpoints in Iran, Taiwan, Korea, Syria, in all of which the US government is behaving in a manner that makes World War III more likely. But the leading contender for Archduke Ferdinand of Armageddon is Ukraine. The good news is that the shine is wearing off. A CNN poll finds a slight majority in the United States opposed to how Biden is handling Ukraine. Corporate newspapers list the war on a long list of Biden's failures. Among elected officials, Republicans make partisan noises about possibly not funding this war with every last possible dollar forever, maybe. But let's keep this in context. There has never been a war this wearing off of the shine didn't happen with. There's no critique of militarism permitted in corporate media or national US politics, unless it's about Japan. Wonderful op-ed in the New York Times today about ending militarism in Japan. The slight criticism that's permitted of war spending is used to prevent criticism of corporate profits or of self-destructive sanctions, or indeed of ordinary non-Ukraine war spending, which is in the process of being dramatically increased with no opposition in Congress or mention in the media. As corporate profits and sanctions combine with war spending to create higher gas prices for people lacking both mass transportation and media outlets that allow any talk of shifting war spending into mass transportation. The main current of corporate commentary still drifts between predictions of imminent victory and resolutions to stay the course no matter how long it takes, with no useful discussion of what the war means for nuclear dangers, for global handling of climate or pandemics or refugees, or for the spending of resources on useful and necessary things. Properly and gloriously pursuing the war is, of course, opposed to shamefully and treasonously negotiating an end to the war. Once begun, wars must simply last forever rather than be lost, as they all must be if they aren't continued. The operations that are not doomed to defeat are handled as coups or threats or bribes, not wars. But some of them, if they last long enough, are likely to defeat the entire enterprise of life on Earth. And some people seem to realize this while pushing ahead anyway. New York City recently released a painfully ludicrous public safety video with tips for surviving a nuclear bomb, such as, and I quote, "Get inside." And the response was mostly not to point out what a bomb does or why there would be multiple bombs or how a nuclear winter happens, but rather to mock the very idea that nuclear war is worth worrying about. The facts suggest it is more likely than ever, but a decision has been made to simply treat it as impossible. A recent poll showed a grand total of 0% of people in the United States worried about war, nuclear or otherwise, as their top concern, and 1% worried about climate, with 33% concerned about inflation as their top concern, which is actually good for people who have debts, and 15% concerned about gas prices, which is completely understandable, even though higher gas prices is the one pro-climate change that's been made in the United States. Needless to say, we need a ceasefire and a negotiated settlement. Numerous world governments have said so, but not done much to make it happen. Unfortunately, neither side much likes the idea, preferring to gamble with human life for a bigger win. As with the war in Korea and many others, a negotiated settlement would look a lot like pre-war agreements. albeit with a lot of people dead and buildings destroyed. And who wants that? Not the right-wing militarists in Ukraine or Russia, not weapons dealers, not media outlets, not people who actually believe 6 years of tales of Russia stealing US elections and owning Donald Trump, not people who believe that either Russia or NATO had no choice and have no choice, and that it's all a little bit exciting. I believe that Biden and Putin are trying their absolute best to imagine that they are living in World War II right now, as depicted in US and Russian celebrations. Each declares he is fighting Hitlerian forces, even though they are fighting each other. Each declares war and escalation to be absolutely inevitable, and therefore the gravest sin to be appeasement of the other side. Each swears the fight to be purely defensive, and yet that defensiveness to require endless fighting for the goal of unconditional surrender by the aggressor. The lessons that both sides have learned from World War II are: war is glorious. War is inevitable, so you'd better start it and win it. There is no nonviolent alternative to war. The evil of the other side justifies any and all evil by yourself. The lessons they ought to have learned are: war is the worst thing there is. Reckless disregard for peace is extremely dangerous. Nonviolent action, powerful even 75 years ago, has developed into the most effective set of tools. Evil cannot be justified, and risking nuclear war is madness. It's impossible for either side to see this, but Russia and NATO depend on each other. Whichever side you are on, you agree with weapons maker propaganda that the available actions in the world are: 1, war, and 2, doing nothing. You ignore the historical record of nonviolent action succeeding more often than war, and you imagine militarism to be required completely independently from considering what the results will be. It's possible for some people to glimpse the stupidity and counterproductive nature of war as long as they look at old wars and don't apply any lessons learned to current wars. There's an author in Germany of a book about the stupidity of World War I who is right now busy telling people to stop learning lessons from him and applying them to Ukraine. Many are able to look somewhat honestly at the 2003 begun stage of the US war on Iraq, the pretended weapons of mass destruction, according to CIA predictions, were only likely to be used if Iraq were attacked. So Iraq was attacked. A big part of the problem was supposedly how much those people hated us. So although the surest way to make people hate you was to attack them, they were attacked. NATO has spent decades hyping, exaggerating, and lying about a Russian threat, or simply drooling over the possibility of a Russian attack, inevitably knowing that it would radically boost NATO membership, bases, weapons, and popular support by attacking, even if the attack actually demonstrated its military weakness. Russia proclaimed that because of the NATO threat, it must attack and enlarge the NATO threat. Of course, I'm the lunatic for suggesting that Russia should have used unarmed civilian defense in Donbass. But is there anyone alive who thinks NATO would have been able to add all these new members and bases and weapons and US troops without the radical escalation of the war in Ukraine by Russia? Will anyone pretend that NATO's biggest benefactor is Biden or Trump or anyone other than Russia? Sadly, there are a lot of people who do imagine just as ridiculously that NATO expansion wasn't needed to create the Russian invasion, that in fact more NATO expansion would have prevented it. We're supposed to imagine that NATO membership has protected numerous nations from Russian threats that have never been hinted at by Russia, and to completely erase from all human awareness the nonviolent action campaigns, the singing revolutions that some of those nations used to defeat Soviet invasions and kick out the Soviet Union. World Beyond War is planning an online screening of the film The Singing Revolution with a discussion with the filmmakers. NATO expansion made the current war possible, and further NATO expansion as a response to it is insane. Russian war making drives NATO expansion, and further Russian war making is a lunatic's response to NATO. Yet here we are, with Lithuania blockading Kaliningrad. Here we are with Russia putting nukes into Belarus. Here we are with the US saying not one word about that violation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty by Russia, because it's long had nukes in 5 other countries: Germany, Netherlands, Belgium, Italy, Turkey, and has just put them into a 6th, the UK, and had put bases capable of launching nukes into Poland and Romania as a key step in the steady and predictable buildup to this disaster. Russian dreams of quickly conquering Ukraine and dictating the results were plain nuts, if actually believed. US dreams of conquering Russia with sanctions are sheer madness, if actually believed. But what if the point is not to believe in these things so much as to counter hostility with hostility, having taken a principled stand within one's head against acknowledging any alternatives? It doesn't matter whether attacking Ukraine will work. NATO continues its relentless advance, refuses to negotiate, and aims eventually at attacking Russia. So our choices are to attack Ukraine or do nothing. This despite NATO's need for Russia as an enemy, despite the desire spelled out in that RAND study and by USAID to provoke Russia into a war in Ukraine and not to attack Russia. This despite the fact that it would surely backfire. It doesn't matter whether sanctions will work. They've failed dozens of times, but it's a question of principle. One must not do business with the enemy, even if sanctions strengthen the enemy, even if they create more enemies, even if they isolate you and your club more than the target. It doesn't matter. The choice is escalation or doing nothing. And even if actually doing nothing would be better, doing nothing simply means an unacceptable choice. Both sides are thus mindlessly escalating towards nuclear war, convinced there are no off-ramps, yet pouring black paint on the windshield for fear of seeing what lies ahead. I went on a Russian US radio show recently and tried to explain to the hosts that Russian war making was as evil as anyone else's, and they wouldn't stand for that, of course, though they made that claim themselves. One of the hosts denounced the evils of the NATO assault on the former Yugoslavia and demanded to know why Russia shouldn't have the right to use similar excuses to do the same thing to Ukraine. Needless to say, I replied that NATO should be condemned for its wars and Russia for its wars, and when they go to war with each other, they should both be condemned. Now, this being the actual real world, there is, of course, nothing equal about any 2 wars or any 2 militaries or any 2 war lies. So I will be weeding out the emails responding to this, screaming at me for equating everything. But being anti-war, as these radio hosts and many other people repeatedly claimed to be in between their comments supporting war, actually requires opposing wars. It seems to me that the very least that war supporters could do would be to stop claiming to be anti-war, but that will not be enough to save us. We also need a massive global demand for a ceasefire and a negotiated peace, and people can start by signing the ceasefire petition at worldbeyondwar.org. And thank you, Vijay, and everyone else for including me here.
Thank you, David, for the illuminating presentation. Our next speaker, the third speaker, is Lindsey German, an eminent UK peace activist, convener of Stop the War Coalition, and co-author of A People's History of London. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Lindsey German.
Thank you very much, Vijay, and thanks for inviting me. I want to very much, I hope, build on the points that you've made and that David has made in his presentation. I mean, I guess there'll be a high level of agreement here among peace activists as to what the situation is, but just to spell out the kind of way that we've approached it from Stop the War in Britain, which is that when the invasion happened, we opposed the invasion by Russia. We said we didn't think it was justified, and that's still the position that that we hold. But we also said from the very beginning that this conflict didn't start a few months ago. The prospects for war didn't start a few months ago. These were a very long time in the making, and it's been spelt out that the role of NATO in particular since the end of the Cold War has been, in my view, a role which has been not a defensive role at all, but has been an aggressive role. It's been about the expansion of NATO member states, as people have said, and obviously we're now facing the situation of Finland and Sweden joining NATO. We also know that in Ireland, where there is big public opinion against joining NATO, and very long historic tradition to do with the independence from Britain and everything else, why the neutrality in Ireland has been such an important thing. But there as well, the Irish government is trying to enforce this, the NATO membership for and the end of Irish neutrality, which is a very big political question for Ireland. So I think you've got to look at that, and I think you also have to look not just at the NATO expansion and the increasing number of member states, and obviously most particularly the increase in the member states in Eastern Europe, and the promise that was made at the end of the Cold War that NATO wouldn't expand past the German border obviously has been ignored, and that now NATO exists 1,000 miles east of the German border, and all the things that means. But also, of course, NATO has been involved in wars, the bombing of Yugoslavia in 1999, 78 days of bombing, consecutive days of bombing, the invasion and occupation of Afghanistan, which ended in humiliating defeat for the Western powers, the NATO powers last year, the bombing of Libya in 2011. I think all of these you can see as creating not just an aggressive persona, if you like, for NATO, but also of creating a situation where wars became one of the major features of the 21st century, and that these were things which became more and more part of things, most notably in Iraq, but throughout the whole period of the war on terror. The difference, I think, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I suppose you could say there's two differences. One is that this is a direct invasion by Russia, not by Britain or not by the United States, and that certainly gives it a different impact in terms of certainly in Britain, and I'm sure in other NATO countries as well. But also, of course, as has been the point has been made, is that this isn't the kind of asymmetrical warfare that we talked about with, for example, Afghanistan, which didn't have an air force, or comparable countries. This is conflict between major military and economic powers, and nuclear powers. And we have, on the one hand, Russia has nuclear weapons, on the other hand, the NATO countries, the US, Britain and France also have weapons, and have the weapons stationed in a number of other countries as well. So we're talking about a situation where the prospect for world war, I think, is greater than certainly any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, and possibly at any time since the Second World War or perhaps the Korean War. So very, very serious situation we are in. I think you have to see the war in Ukraine now as a proxy war between the NATO powers on the one hand and Russia on the other. And I think this is becoming absolutely clear from the attitudes, particularly of the United States and British governments, which have really led the way in terms of arming Ukraine, in terms of ensuring that heavy weaponry goes to Ukraine and ensuring that the war is prolonged. And I think this is very important. As people will know, there were peace talks which took place in the first few months of the war. Every time it looked as though there might be some settlement or some fruition coming from those peace talks, Boris Johnson would go to Kiev and would ensure that the war continued. And the reason that the US and the UK and the other NATO powers want the war to continue is because they think Russia can be defeated. They didn't think this initially with the war, but the course of the war, the way that it has gone, they think this is much more likely. And I think when we look at that, I think it's always worth bearing in mind, for those of us who've been campaigning against war for many, many years, I think sometimes you almost forget to highlight exactly what a horrific circumstance war is. But I think it is worth saying that the people who are the big losers here are the Ukrainian people who've become refugees, who've suffered death, displacement, injury, and all the pressures on their lives, all the pressures on their mental health, their physical health, and all those other things that are affected by war. And we see this around the world. We see it in Yemen, we see it, we've seen it in Syria, we've seen it in Iraq and Afghanistan. Another group of people who are really suffering very directly, it seems to me, are the Russian troops. Very high numbers of casualties in this war, much higher than most of the Western wars. And this is something I think that we should bear in mind. So there is not a good war here, and there is not a war where there is going to be a good outcome. Seems to me if you don't have an escalation of the war, there are only two other possibilities. One is that the war will drag on in Ukraine for years and will take on some of the character of the Afghan war. In other words, it will be a very long, slow, bitter war of attrition with very heavy casualties on both sides and with huge impact, obviously, on the people of Ukraine and to a lesser extent, the people in Russia. The other alternative is, of course, that there has to be a ceasefire and that there have to be negotiations. And I'll come to talk to that maybe in a few minutes, but it seems to me that all the people who say you can't have negotiations with Putin, you can't trust Putin, do we trust any of these people who lead countries that are militarized to the hilt? Do we trust people who've got nuclear weapons that they can use? Do we trust any of these? And it seems to me at the very least, peace talks will be a way of ending the war and then beginning to look for alternatives for peace. And it seems to me that has to be the course that we argue for with our own governments, in our own movements, and as part of an international movement. I think when you look at the worldwide consequences of this war, they are very, very severe indeed, even for people who don't appear to be directly affected by the war. We've got a growing militarization across Europe, particularly in Germany, which has agreed to double its so-called defense spending, its military spending, but everywhere an increase in the level of arms spending, an increase in the level of wealth in each country that goes towards weaponry and war rather than going towards education or health or any of the other spending that we would rather see it on. We've got the growth of the kind of almost commonplace way that people talk now about tactical nuclear weapons as though these are kind of perfectly all right, or people talk about the possibility of a nuclear war without saying that this would annihilate Moscow or London or any of the other cities that were affected by it. And you know, this proliferation of nuclear weapons is exactly the opposite of what the governments of the world say that they want, but it is actually what they are doing, and it contains within it the great dangers that I'm sure we're all aware of. Much more spending on military means less spending on other things, and we've just had, we're having in Britain, the Prime Minister Boris Johnson has resigned, and there are now 2 candidates who are going to campaign to take his place. There were 5 originally. Every single one of them wanted more defence spending. They're talking about this being raised to 3% of GDP. It's already, what, the 4th or 5th highest spending in the world in Britain for military spending, even higher. And this is at a time when people, and I know this is an international phenomenon, where people are suffering a cost of living crisis, where they can't afford fuel, they can't afford food, they can't afford the basics, and where our public services are being severely run down. Another consequence of this war is what's happening in many countries already, not just that food prices are going up, but there are shortages of fuel, there are shortages of food in the forms of wheat and oil, and this is already having dire consequences in parts of the global south, and that is only going to get worse, and it will spread. I think by the autumn and winter, we'll see this not just in some of the poorer countries of the world, we'll see it in all the, including the richest countries in the world. We have, therefore, already huge consequences, as well as the consequence of wider conflict. The British government is one of the most belligerent in the world. The military now talk very, very much about we have to be prepared for war, although they've taken us into wars for more than 20 years, but now those all don't matter or aren't talked about, but now we have to be prepared for war. They say we have to fight in Europe once again, ignoring the fact that the British army was driven out of Iraq in the south in Basra by the Iraqi resistance itself. They were driven out of Afghanistan last year by the Taliban. So the idea that Britain is in a strong state to use its army against Russia in Europe is probably not particularly realistic. Nonetheless, this is the kind of propaganda that we're seeing. We're also seeing big attacks on the anti-war movement and on the left in general. The leader of the Labour Party, which isn't a particularly anti-war party, it was under, or its leadership was under Jeremy Corbyn, but under the present leader is very much in support of all the things that the government is doing in respect of this war. The leader of the Labour Party attacked Stop the War and demanded that left MPs who supported a statement that we put out before the war, which criticised NATO, that they had to have their names taken off, or they would be removed as Labour MPs. And therefore, what they're saying is you can't criticise NATO, you can't criticise its past, you can't criticise what it's doing now, and you can't criticise its plans for the future. And of course, we know that the plans for the future are even more massive expansion of NATO, not just the increase in pulling the neutral states in Europe into a military alliance, but the strategic concept, which talked about far more troops in Eastern Europe, far more direct intervention in Eastern Europe, and of course brought in much more directly than previously the question of China and the role of China as causing concern and worry to the NATO powers. And we know that we've seen the AUKUS Pact in recent months, which was about firming up the alliance between the United States, Australia, and the United Kingdom. So all of these, I think, we're looking at a very, very serious set of problems, the biggest problem that we faced as an anti-war and peace movement for many, many years. So what can we do? Well, I think the first thing that we have to do is to try to establish as many links as we can possibly internationally, that we know that we are in a minority in most countries. Vijay made the point very importantly that many, many countries outside of the NATO powers don't take the same attitude towards this war, and there are at least much, much more ambivalent about it. Nonetheless, in the NATO powers, I think it's clear we are in a minority. I would also say, however, that there is very little enthusiasm, certainly in Britain, and I don't know how people feel in other countries. I think there's very little enthusiasm for more war. There's very little enthusiasm for a lot more military spending. There's very little enthusiasm for any of these things. So I think one of the tasks that we have to do is to link the peace campaigning with some of the other issues which are so concerning millions of people in Britain and elsewhere. The whole question of the cost of living and what we do about it, and what kind of priorities we have as a society, which is always fomenting these wars, which always has the money for these wars. Britain alone is providing $2 billion in terms of military aid to the Ukraine, and we have to look at an alternative to this. And I would like to see, perhaps in the months ahead, whether we've done some coordinated days of action, which have been fairly small events, but they have involved people in different parts of the world, whether we can develop those, whether we can develop more of them, whether we can have more conferences or social forums or those sorts of things where we come together as peace and anti-war activists, but also where we say we want to build the movement in the way that we have done in the past over Afghanistan or Iraq, or any of the ones that we've done in the past. So that, it seems to me, is bringing some of those things together. And of course, we have to put massive pressure on our governments. Our governments are behaving in the most reckless fashion over this war, as they are over climate change, as they are over the economy, as they are over a whole range of issues. And we have to see this, fighting them against the development of these war economies, of the increased militarization, has to be a central part of what we try to do. So those are my initial thoughts on some of this, and thank you again very much for inviting me. I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Lindsey, for a brilliant contribution. Our next speaker is Paul Maillet, an outstanding Canadian peace activist, peace professional, former aerospace engineer or military officer, Canadian Air Force, author From Activism to Governance. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Paul Maillet.
Thank you very much. I hope everyone can hear well. And I hope I have the self-discipline to keep to the time as the previous speakers had. I'm really quite impressed. So thank you. What I'd like to do is maybe take a slightly different tack. I mean, we can have a group hug and all come to a various conclusion, but I think we have to look at some of the out-of-the-box things. And what I'd like to talk about is our role, particular role of what we would subscribe as the peace movement. And the peace movement, in my view, has two big domains. One of them are the peace mediators. And four of the pillars of a peace professional are basically that one is present in the conflict, of which we are just by being here today. But there is a sort of a constraint regarding impartiality. In other words, we have to be able to talk to all sides, the USA, Russia, everybody, if we hope that we're going to have some sort of peace. However, in that domain, we bring certain values of nonviolence, values of human rights. And then the fourth pillar is that we bring certain communication skills, really predicated on nonviolent communication, for example. And in that vein, we are one group. The other group, of course, is the group that's the military-industrial complex. The other group is the peace movement, who have a role in terms of taking sides in confrontation, as opposed to the impartiality rule. So you take sides, you confront, and usually in a blame and accusations game, which is a little bit counter to the nonviolent communication theory. if we want to get to the goal of peace, but a necessary thing. And then the third pillar, of course, is the political domain. You know, the people who can actually make the decisions and run the programs, and finding those people who are more predisposed to peace, ceasefires, all the things that we talked about that would end this particular conflict. And that begs the question is that at some point in making a transition from activism to governance, it's very easy to win the revolution in some cases, as in Egypt and other countries, and it's usually the youth, but you lose at the ballot box. You look at the new president, for example, of Sri Lanka, who was a former president, in spite of the fact that it was the youth that brought down the previous government. So you've got those kind of considerations, and then to look at it from the view of impartiality, I think is really incredibly important. You know, how we view these kinds of things without accusations and blame. And one of the first things that I would go as a former military professional, and I've been to the Ukraine and various places, Iran or whatever, and is that superpowers are not in the habit of winning wars anymore. You look at all the way from Vietnam. I mean, the Americans have had more losses than they've had wins, as they would say. And the reason for that is that, you know, insurgencies generally run the $1.49 war based on small arms, very mobile, and just do the process of attrition. And the result you see today, the Taliban are back in power in Afghanistan, for example, and Iraq is a mess. Countries, you know, are almost becoming failed states in this kind of context. So even if you thought about that in terms of the Ukraine war initially as a thought experiment, what if the Ukrainians had just said, okay, we'll just accede to this and run an insurgency campaign that's going to just draw down or attrit the Russian forces, or as happened, I think, in Denmark in World War II, where the Germans took over Denmark and they didn't want to destroy the country because of the shipbuilding capacity. But the Denmark found any excuse just to slow things down and no end of things. And when you look at the end of the war, how many ships did they build? 0. You know, so there are ways in if one adopts a kind of a Gandhian philosophy of nonviolence, that there are other alternatives. I mean, the carnage and the wreckage and the death that's happened in Ukraine, because Ukraine has elected to you know, fight this war right to the last man, is one alternative they had. I think in hindsight, they may have done things a little bit differently. But we look in the reality that's going on, you know, and we're mindful of the relative peace that we've had since World War II, as Vijay pointed out, and even again with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. We're mindful of the Archduke Ferdinand moment, as was mentioned, the treatment of Russia, our treatment of Russia since 1991, when the Warsaw Pact dissolved, and the emergence of an actor initiating hostilities. You know, Mr. Putin did cross a line and did do an invasion in which he escalated what was essentially an insurgency or a counter-revolution or whatever was going on in the Ukraine. And I was there in 2015. And so we're also mindful of the awareness of just war theory and how this fuels things, the weaknesses, and maybe some coherence in just peace theory, or bringing some coherence to just peace theory. Certainly the realities and limitations of the United Nations, certainly the expansion of NATO, certainly the specter of nuclear weapons, the militarization of the global community, as we've talked about, and then, you know, cousins of war are environmental degradation, pandemics, and a variety of problems. So superpowers have acted, you know, with relative impunity over the decades, all superpowers. And there is a history of winner's justice since World War II that shapes the media and the narrative of all these wars. So, but I would think that the next thing I would talk about is that we have to understand, if we are going, just for a moment, I would invite you to a position of impartiality in these peace mediators kind of thing, is to say, how do military people think when they get into these things? And in my experience, they have what's called a military threat assessment, and they assess three things. They assess motivation, and they assess capacity, and then they assess intention. Now you can easily see that the hardest motivation and capacity are easy to figure out in terms of doctrine or religions or whatever they have. And capacity, you can count their tanks or whatever. But intention is the hard one. Intention is almost impossible to predict. You know, when you're looking at this 5 years ago, or when Yeltsin was the prime minister or the president of Russia, and things looked like they were going in a democratic rule, in comes an actor like Putin, whose intentions are a little different. The Constitution gets warped, and it looks like he's a leader for life, and that he has now gone on in this war, in this invasion, for whatever reasons. And we've talked about all sorts of reasons, and some of them could be true, some of them could not be true. But it's that evaluation of that intention, because you need to make a decision. This is not just an experiment like in philosophy. You know, give me the solution from a categorical imperative kind of position. You want to say, give me a solution. You know, and what you're doing is a heuristic solution in which you're trying to think of something or come to some conclusion on the basis of insufficient information. So the insufficient information usually relies in the domain of intentions. So we have to understand the intentions of Russia or Putin, but also the intentions of the United States, NATO, all the actors and parties in this, including the Ukraine. So I guess the title of this presentation is, how does all of this get us to World War III? And from my perspective, we look at sort of producing conditions for peace. And what are conditions for peace that we can envisage? I mean, there is one principle that says, you know, pounding stakes in the ground is not negotiation. You know, one has to set aside fixed views, at least for a minute, and look at some domain of sympathetic understanding of the entire situation to look at that. There has to be a readiness and willingness of all parties to come to peace, or as we see right now, this could drag on a long time. But readiness and willingness is usually connected to exhaustion. I mean, there's some issues, and there's a saying, you know, when they love their children more than they love land or this war, then maybe there will be some peace. I heard that in the context of gun control in the United States. When you love your children more than you love your guns, maybe we'll have less gun violence. And that kind of thinking when it comes down to establishing conditions for war. And then we have the existence of means of communication. I mean, we are looking at a media which has a relentless, absolutely relentless campaign of talking about this war. Every time somebody donates a tank or an arm or something, as opposed to issues of peace, you know, peace negotiations. Where's the relentless diplomacy in that regard, trying to seek at least that the table is set so that if this exhaustion occurs or these other conditions occur, that this can be realized quite quickly. So, and in that domain, one of the things is we've got to start using nonviolent communication. Otherwise, all we do is solidify both sides and each party, and you get an impasse, and we get exactly what we have. So I probably wouldn't want to say what a way forward it looks like. You know, it looks like we are, at least in the peace movement, we find ourselves in a bit of paralysis now and then, just because of the momentum of the military-industrial complex and the momentum of the war as it goes on. Certainly one of the principles of war is the plan and the intentions and everything only last until you cross the start line. Then all bets are off. It all takes on a life of its own, and extremely, extremely hard to stop. We've got to look at relational solutions before we look at transactional solutions. I mean, even in the say the Israeli-Palestinian context, you can have all the agreements you like, but if both parties don't like each other and decide to pass on cultures of hate and violence and from generation to generation, you're really not going to get anywhere. except maybe in the short term. So there is that domain of getting some relational solutions with regards to outreach to Russia, in addition to the transactional solutions that we have. And certainly, I think the biggest point I would make is that we have to have a transition of our worldview with regards to war and peace. Right now, the current worldview, and even enshrined in the United Nations, is enshrined in just peace theory, just war theory. Rather. And what just war theory does is it validates and it allows you to go to war within circumstances. It starts with just cause, and the moment that you invoke just cause, you invoke the death penalty. And everything flows from there. The use of arms that you have and the combatants and how you try to limit these things. And right at the very bottom, the absolute bottom, is to minimize collateral damage in civilians in that respect. So what you have done is you've created some conditions in which people can go to war, and certainly they can warp these conditions in a just sense. Now, if one took a worldview in which that was flipped on its head and had a very, very highly coherent body of knowledge, like just war theory, the laws of armed conflict, that said, we start with stopping the violence, caring for the victims and civilian damage. So we start there. And then we work our way down to negotiations and reconstruction and various things. And at the very, very bottom, we could consider justice and reconciliation, rather than starting with the principle of justice, which invoked the use of force. So if there was a body of law in terms of peace operations that were mandated as a very strict precursor, in other words, you have to go through these steps before you can invoke the laws of armed conflict. So you would have a very robust body there that has to be accommodated in international law before you can even think about crossing the start line and invading another country under whatever pretext that you're thinking about. Or you immediately start from a position of war crimes in that domain. So it would be the protection, care, stop the violence, care for the victims, safe havens, all those sorts of things that you can do, humanitarian aid, whatever, before one is justified in using armed conflict. So I would leave it at that. If there are any other questions, we can explore them as the question period goes on. So thank you kindly.
Thank you, Paul, for illuminating contribution. Our last speaker of the day is Reverend Brian Cooper, a noted peace activist from Scotland, Vice President and Interfaith Churches Secretary for Uniting for Peace. And I'm sure we're going to hear some religious point of view about this conflict or interfaith point of view about Ukraine war. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Brian Cooper.
You need to unmute yourself, Brian.
You have to unmute. Can we unmute him as a co-host or host?
I'm pressed.
I think we can. What we can do is ask him to unmute.
I've just pressed the unmute. I've just pressed the button.
Good.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you now.
You can hear me, right. I wanted to make some reflections on the role of religion in this crisis. I first of all wanted to make some comments on the recent statement of our Foreign Secretary Liz Truss, who was addressing the Global Ministerial Summit on Freedom of Religion and did so in the presence of the Prince of Wales. This was only last week in London. And she said that Vladimir Putin was waging a holy war and that he was threatening religious freedom because he was destroying churches, mosques, and synagogues in the Ukraine. Now, it must be said there's no evidence at all that this is happening, because if it was happening, certainly President Zelensky would have made an issue of this, he would have publicized it, and it would have been used as propaganda against Putin. The main reason why Putin is not doing this, he himself knows, at least the Orthodox churches, the famous shrines, the famous monasteries, in which he himself, in happier times, has worshipped with Ukrainian Orthodox Christians, as well as Russian Christians there. So this kind of lie is very, very dangerous and shows the ignorance of one of the contenders to be prime minister. Now, religion has always been a very significant factor in the internal life of both Russia and Ukraine, and in the relations between them. And historically, for centuries, Eastern Orthodox Christianity was and remains the dominant expression of Christianity in both countries and in Belarus. And for a long time, they've been deemed to form what is called a spiritual union under the authority and jurisdiction of the Russian Orthodox Church, the Moscow Patriarchate in the Soviet times, with only one tiny exception. All the Orthodox in the Ukraine were in the single Ukraine Orthodox Church linked with Moscow. But with the end of communism and with the independence of Ukraine, that picture changed. The previous pro-Catholic Uniate Church was re-established. This is an Orthodox worshipping church which has links to the Pope, recognizes the Pope's authority. That was re-established. Protestant churches flourished, and above all, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine, Metropolitan Filaret of Kiev, and a member of the Russian Orthodox Holy Synod, he broke away from Moscow and he formed his own church, his own Ukraine Orthodox Church, Kiev Patriarchate, because he aligned himself with the nationalist forces in the Ukraine. And this was a very sad development, a very bitter development. And it's interestingly, I actually for many years knew Filaret personally because he was prominent in the Christian Peace Conference, in which I was very active. But one consequence was that a number of the churches and monasteries belonging to the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine were forcibly seized by nationalist gangs. However, most Ukraine Orthodox Christians remain loyal to the Moscow Patriarchate, but not influenced by political considerations. 2014 saw the Maidan crisis, the annexation or recovery of Crimea by Russia. And of course, the Russian Orthodox Church became the dominant church in the Crimea. But the president of Ukraine, President Poroshenko at that time, decided he wanted a firmly anti-Russian church, closely aligned with the Ukrainian state. And so he declared that Filaret's church, which wasn't internationally recognized, will be the new official church for Ukraine, together with a small breakaway church which joined in. Now, the titular head of Orthodoxy across the world is the Patriarchate of Constantinople, Patriarch Bartholomew. And for reasons unclear, but probably American pressure, he upheld this. And the Moscow Patriarch Church found itself devalued, and this new pro-nationalist church established. And many churches belonging to the Moscow Patriarchate were forcibly seized. Now, Putin protested very strongly against this. And it must be realized, of course, that Putin himself is a very pious Orthodox Christian. He was never a Marxist. He was never a communist. He was never an atheist. While in the KGB, Putin wore his cross to the surprise of his fellow officers. And he said, I neither conceal my faith, nor do I flaunt it. So he was very upset about this change of the church situation in the Ukraine. But that is not a reason for the current war. Now, when Putin invaded the Ukraine, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, Patriarch Kirill, endorsed the invasion, that he supported it, not for the reasons that Putin gave for Russian security, but because he said it was a war of civilization to defend Russia against the decadent West. And Kirill cited gay parades as a symptom of Western decadence. Now, Putin and Kirill are very close. They have a close relationship. And Putin realized that with the end of communism in Russia, there was a huge psychological and psychic vacuum for many people. Communist values were abandoned, and the philosophy was abandoned. So Putin has created, with Kirill, a new national narrative. And that is that the Orthodox heritage of Russia, and also strong patriotism focused on victory in the Second World War, and strong Russian nationalism, and the strong state, but a multicultural one, which certainly embraces the Muslim citizens of Russia. This is the new post-communist Russian national narrative. And an extension of this is what is called the Russian world ideology. This is much criticized in some quarters, but basically it means that Putin and Kirill both believe that all Russians, wherever they are, whether they're in Russia itself or the national minorities in other countries, are all unified ideologically, spiritually, through orthodoxy, and if possible, politically. So that is part of the reality. However, it cannot be just the view that Putin is fighting a kind of a holy war in Ukraine cannot be upheld. He has never used religious terms about the war. He's never referred to it in those terms at all. And that is not part of the dynamic. It's part of the background, part of the interrelationship between the two countries, but not a dynamic for the war. So I would offer these comments on the situation. I would agree with much of the previous speakers have said. I think the only way in which the war is going to come to an end, I suspect, is that when both sides can, in some sense, claim some kind of victory, because a moment of exhaustion will come. Wars of attrition come to a point of exhaustion. Russia cannot sustain its casualties, nor can Ukraine sustain the destruction. So there has to be a point at which both sides say, well, we've won up to a point, therefore we must come to the table. We can only hope that that will be soon. Thank you very much.
Okay, that is the finish of all the speakers. And now it's the time for all the people attending the conference, all you delegates. And I can see one hand there of Henrik. Henrik, unmute yourself and speak. Okay, just before you speak, please keep the questions short, and the same for speakers. Please answer in a short contributions, please. Thank you, Henrik.
Okay, my name is Heiner. I'm here from Berlin. I'm running the Anti-War Cafe, and I have to admit that I'm 100% anti-war, but at the same time, I fully 100% understand what Russia is saying, why they started this military operation I do not support it, but I think it's understandable. The introduction to this call reads why Russia is relentlessly bombing cities to capture as much territory of the Ukraine as possible. I think this is a narrative used by, unfortunately, by many in the peace movement and also by many in the left. And I'm asking, why are you putting it this way? I think this is not correct. We have to kind of get the facts straight. The Ukrainians are using civilians as human shields. They are like influenced by Nazi ideology and all kinds of levels of politics, although not all Ukrainians are Nazis, but I mean the main guys in the military, in the police, in the secret service, they are Nazis. They are like outright right-wingers, and we have to understand also the Russian argument that there were forewarnings of an immediate looming attack on the Donbas regions and the Crimea. We have seen the documents presented at the news conference. You can say this is maybe fake, but we have to wait and see. I think they're gonna present more. Also, you have this Bucha incident, which looks like very much like a false flag attack. And on top of all that, there are statements all the time by the Russian leadership telling NATO to stop provoking Russia anymore. And remember, Russians stand in a large majority behind their government and behind the war even. And moreover, most Russians have relatives in their families who died in World War II. More than 27 million people were killed. And finally, we need to take note of the position in a few countries, and quite a few countries, for example, in Latin America, where you have countries backing Russia, also like full out, not attacking, not the war, not attacking Ukraine, but the idea why they entered this war, which was going on already since 2014. And I think,
Thank you, Henrik.
we have, this is my statement here. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I'm going to take 3 questions and then give opportunity to speakers to answer them. Next one is Angela. And
Are you talking to Agneta?
yeah. Go on.
Well, my question is, I've been following this since, like Heinrich said, 2014, when the Nazis took over in Kiev, and Victoria Nuland made a putsch, a coup d'etat, and put Arseny Yatsenyuk, the Nazi, in power. My question is to all of you. I've been a little bit annoyed and almost planned to leave the meeting in anger because you jump 8 years from the 22nd of February straight to the 23rd of February. No, February, yes, this year, when Russians, after many negotiations, took this step, asked actually by Donetsk, Slavyansk, Luhansk to help them. They have early on asked for help. And I asked you, each of you, how come that you take this jump from 14 to 24, 8 years of silence, when 14,000, I say it again, were killed by the Azov battalion. How come? Thank you.
Thank you. One more question, and then we will have speakers answer it. Didier, if I pronounce the name right.
Yes, okay. I thought there were people before me, at least in the chat. But okay. First, thank you for organizing this meeting. I heard very few, let's say, attempts to think about this this conflict. Second point is I had no time to listen to everything, but I like the intervention of Paul Maillet. I think it's a good one. and I would like to have it maybe more concrete in the proposals. And okay, I have only one concrete question to all people who are speaking is there are ways, let's say, to have a conflict but without violence. So there are ways to have a non-civil, non-violent civil defense, or non-violent even civil attacks sometimes. And you can use, among other aspects, new technologies, cyber technologies. What do you think, if you think that's a good idea in some aspects, where and how could we use that? I mean, to stop fights on both sides. And maybe one comment, just I expected to be disappointed by some people having really caricatural points of view concerning the side of Russia or the side of the United States. And I see that I'm not disappointed in this aspect. How is it possible to think that Russia was going to help the Russian minorities when it was going to Kiev and not to these places? But okay, I'm stopping there. Thank you for organizing this once again.
Okay, now is the turn of the speakers. Can we start with David?
Yes, I'm glad we're having this discussion. Great questions. I can't speak to the words that Heinrich was quoting because they weren't mine, and I wouldn't have written or said them. I think Heinrich made a number of factual points that were absolutely accurate to my knowledge. I do have concern, as I always do, with this notion of, well, I do not support it, but I understand it. You know, obviously, we don't want to advocate the position of, well, the Russians are incomprehensible, irrational. We can't even understand them. They just did this out of sheer lunacy, you know. But this notion of I don't support it, but I kind of sort of support it is also a problem. And I think we have to be very clear that that everybody understands, everybody in this forum understands what's been happening. And I apologize to Agneta. I've, over the past several months, I have just done so many goddamn dozens of webinars where I go through the history of the context and what happened in the previous decades. And I'm so tired of it. And I would never have expected to get through a webinar without at least 2 or 3 other people doing it, and many people do it better than I do. I recommend a forthcoming book by Medea Benjamin and Sandy Davies that does it. But yes, of course, we have to know the history of how you get to something and not do like children's textbooks and pretend that a war simply started out of nothing in one day. And to Didier, if I'm saying that right, I think, yes, absolutely. This is the key topic, 100%. We need to be educating people and governments about how to plan and organize unarmed civilian protection rather than war, which some governments have plans for and most don't, and most people have never even heard of, and support groups like Nonviolent Peace Force that are very slowly and belatedly on a small scale trying to figure out a way to do something in this conflict in Ukraine.
Thank you. Lindsey?
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for the contributions. You know, I think we have to be very careful here because, you know that we get from our governments a whole number of different arguments which are dishonest, don't tell the whole truth about what's going on. We hear very, very one-sided reports. We hear all these, I mean, there was something on the television I was watching the other day where they say, isn't it terrible that Russia is shelling the, I can't remember which city it was, but then a minute later they show Western weapons being used by Ukrainian troops without any kind of, any kind of equivalence. But of course, at the end of all of these, there's somebody who's likely to be killed or injured by these sorts of things. But what I don't feel, and I don't agree, I think, with the two first speakers on this, I don't feel that just because we know we can't trust our government, just because we know that it has lied about all sorts of things, including all the wars that it's been involved in, and you wouldn't think that there'd been a war practically before this one. There's suddenly all these journalists who tell us how terrible the war is and how people are suffering, and we never heard this. We still don't hear it about Yemen, we don't hear it about Iraq, we don't hear it about Afghanistan. I don't think, however, you can go from criticizing our own governments, which I think is absolutely essential, to justifying what Putin did. I personally don't think it's justified at all. I mean, even if you look at it in terms of basic international law, actually, one country should not invade another, and that is what happened. Now, so I think it's wrong to, if we're peace campaigners and anti-war campaigners, to justify what Putin did. I'm not saying that's what people are doing here, but I think that would be wrong to do so. And I think we have to be clear that this war is going to run out of control. Okay, that isn't perhaps even mainly Putin's fault, but you have to say that the invasion was something which was wrong and which has contributed to this. And I don't see that you can approach it another way. And I think if you do approach it another way, and again, this is my experience in the trade union movement in Britain and the labour movement in Britain, and I suspect it's true in a number of other countries, I think all you do is cut yourself off from people who would be willing to campaign with you, but who don't like what Russia has done and who do think it's unjustified to do so. So I think it's I think this is the starting point we have to have. And of course, the history since 2014 is very important. And I did campaign in 2014. We had a campaign that I was involved in against what was going on with the fascist attacks and all these sorts of things. But the truth of the matter is, as well, the majority of people in Ukraine are not fascists. And I think it's important that we do make that distinction.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Lindsey. Paul?
Thank you very much, Lindsey. I really appreciate your comment. And I would echo support. One of them is there is no justification whatsoever for an armed invasion without imminent, clear, and ongoing danger. And what that would have taken in order to establish anything in just cause laws of armed conflict would have been an invasion of Russia proper. One would have had to go in some invasion right into Russia. On the question of human shields, in international law, the use of human shields is a war crime. Also, attacking people who are using human shields is also a war crime. In other words, if you're using a hospital and they're going to try to designate it as a legitimate combatant target, it is not. And the answer to all of this is you have to find another way. You just cannot willy-nilly go in there and destroy the hospital. No matter what the tactical or strategic situation is. The third thing is I was in work. I was with OSCE with regards to helping elections, and I did the election for Poroshenko and the two previous elections through the Maidan. And at the time when I was there, we were down in the Zaporizhzhia area. There'd been about 8,000 people, I think, killed at that point with regards to the separatist issue. And there is certainly, it's certainly clear that there was enough blame to go around as to who's doing what to whom. And there certainly was some legitimate complaints or concerns on the part of the people there. But I do know that the predominant number of people, and I had 26 villages to visit and help out in this area, were not in favor of anything with regards to Russian intervention. I recall going into one village, and I could show you a photograph of it. There was a billboard that must have been 20 feet by 20 feet, was a picture of Putin with a Hitler mustache and the hair and all of that kind of thing. You know, and I did say to them, I says, you know, if the Russians ever come through here, you've got yourself a big problem. So
What
there
part of
is
Ukraine? Excuse me, what part of Ukraine are you referring to?
the Zaporizhia Oblast was where I was assigned, right next to the Donetsk Oblast by about an hour's drive, all the way down to the Sea of Azov. Yeah.
Brian,
And then the last point, I would just like to make one more point with regards to Dieter. We are working this issue of the worldview and the laws of just peace in terms of UN Resolution 52243. So we hold a high-level forum each year, of which we are trying to advance this.
Thank you. Brian, you got a comment?
Yes,
Yeah.
from a very different angle. I mean, one of the great disappointments and surprises in this whole crisis is that the European Union has totally changed its nature and its role. The European Union, as we know, in the post-war period, was just set up to establish peace in Europe by binding nations together economically and politically and by other means, and over the years has played an important role, not least in Northern Ireland, as your book showed, in promoting peace across the European continent. But once this broke out, the EU did not make any attempt at a mediation role, which I found very surprising. It didn't attempt to be a peacemaker between both sides. It aligned itself entirely with NATO, entirely with the US, and became the kind of economic warfare arm of NATO. And this close alignment of the EU with NATO, I think, is a very, very retrograde step, changing its nature, and has very grave consequences for the future. Because those of us who look to the EU as a beacon for peace across the whole of Europe, well, we're now deeply, deeply disappointed and very worried about that. And I'm sure you, Vijay, would say something about that as well.
Thank you, Brian. Now I've got 4 more people who have raised their hands. I'm going to start with Wolfgang. Your question, please, Wolfgang.
Yes. Yeah, my question is the following. I have heard from Oliver Stone, who said before the Russians invaded, the Ukraine government had decided to start a war with Donetsk and Luhansk. And he said there would have been a massacre. And he said, who would have stopped him? The West would not have stopped him. The UN would not have stopped them. And in Russia, they see these victims from the attacks of the West Ukraine, supported by the CIA, with their weapons and with their military education since 8 years, where they killed people there. And you all know, Zelensky has said, I ignore Minsk. These people in Luhansk and Donetsk are terrorists. We don't speak with them. We look for a violent solution. And the Americans, the US regime has said, we support with all means the Ukraine to get the full sovereignty about the whole country. I think it was even a law in the parliament made in this direction. So this we have to consider. I don't support the war of Putin, but we always should say the violence has started from the Kiev regime in 2014 when they went with tanks to the East Ukraine to attack them, when they defended their government, which was brought down, but it was a legal government which was constituted in a democratic election.
Okay, thank you, Wolf.
No, I have 1 point more, please. Sorry. For our campaign, I think we should center on the victims in the war. Therefore, this war has immediately to end. We need ceasefire because every day you hear hundreds of people are dying at the front line. And many families are mourning because they lose their relatives. So I would put inside that we develop sympathy for the victims on both sides, in Ukraine, from Russia, and say, therefore, we need ceasefire.
Okay,
and
thank
we
you, Wolfgang. Derek?
Yeah, let me come very short. I have two proposals. Yeah, I would say we should say, if Russia supports the idea of ceasefire and peace negotiations, we should stop the sanctions. And we should say to the Ukraine, if you don't support ceasefire negotiations, we don't give you 1 cent anymore. On this way, I think we can make bring pressure on both sides to go in this direction.
Yeah, thank you. Derek? Derek?
Yes, thank you. I blame so much the United States for this war in Ukraine. The United States has been threatening the world for so long, and Russia specifically, because we have had to have enemies to support our military industrial complex. What nation has 800 bases in 125 countries? The United States. What does that do to people around the world regarding the United States? And Russia, as it was pointed out earlier, lost 27, 28 million people in World War II. Not a person in Russia today did not lose somebody in World War II. And they just don't want to be threatened anymore by the United States increasing NATO all around their borders. And we have made the Russians the villains of the world for so long. I think Putin, and you can't support him invading another country like you can't support the United States invading Iraq or invading Afghanistan, or today the United States has drone programs all over the world, killing people willy-nilly without asking anybody. So I just think you can't support what Putin's doing, but I am not surprised that he was brought to that place.
Okay, thank you. Todd, you have got your name wrong.
Okay.
Am I supposed to speak?
Yeah, it's your turn.
Thank you.
What's your
Yes, I would like to add another dimension. I think we have to understand that the peace movement has different strengths and that we have to live with that to a certain degree. We see it at this meeting, and it will be like this in the future as well. But I'm critical towards all the contribution on one specific point, and it's the lack of understanding the background in a wider sense, which make us unable to address NATO. The fact right now is that NATO is establishing a climate policy. What they are claiming is that the climate is a security issue. With other words, it's not an issue that should be addressed by cooperation among nations and people. It's an issue that should be addressed as a national security issue. Following that, they also claim that everyone had to be part of a corporate agenda by simply being that kind of civil society that cooperates with business and states for stable social solutions and ecological solutions. And anyone who is against this is then, of course, a national security, either extremist or foreign agent. And I would say this is what we see in UK, and what we are facing is growing repression against all movements. I will put in the chat some text about this and a longer sort of analysis. We have also made a webinar specifically on this thing. And obviously this is not at all NATO, it's all the rich man clubs, including European Union. And we see a very stronger and stronger unity among all Richmond clubs. And we see a need to face this reality in terms of common struggle globally against starvation, against austerity politics, the refugee crisis, etc., etc. And I would say some part of the peace movement has to be part of such broader alliances that understands that all the movements now have to be part of one movement. We are not longer movements of movements. We are not going to specify our movement as the only movement. We have to see this in common while maintaining, of course, our common. Richmond clubs, somebody asked. Richmond clubs are organizations like International Monetary Fund, who is ruled by United States, especially in all the rich countries, including my own Sweden. European Union is a Richmond club for rich countries. And you have a lot of other, these kind of Davos is partly this thing as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Your turn, John.
Great, thank you. I thought you were going to go on and ask David and everybody to respond, but I would like to kind of duplicate what Derek said. But my question to all of you is basically, for me, going back to what the core, finding what the core reasons are that we are prevented from achieving peace. And again, I look, as Derek was, to the United States and our corporate-owned government. And we haven't got, I think, a prayer of achieving peace as long as we're fighting the tall skyscrapers full of business people and lawyers and who are finding all kinds of ways to sell weapons. And this is a major part of our economy. And I'm hoping that you all will be able to find solutions to, as the previous speaker said, for us to get together and get on the same page with yelling the same words at Lockheed and all of the big military spenders. And somehow or another, we have to win the PR battle against, and somehow get back the United States, because my look at it is that we're kind of running the show militarily, and along with Israel and a few others. Looking at the strategies of battle and who starts what is look at the money and who owns and operates the world at this point.
Okay.
So can you guys come up with some way to pull us together and to talk more somehow about the core, at least what I see as the core?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, John. Now, it's the turn of the contributors. I start again with David.
Thanks, Vijay. Thank you all for the discussion and questions. In terms of things that people can agree on, I agreed 100% with what Wolfgang had to say when he said what we should do in terms of addressing the Western governments and their sanctions and their weapons dealing. I happen to also agree with peace activists in Russia. But if somebody wants to oppose only one side of a war, I agree with them. And if somebody wants to oppose only the other side of that war, I agree with them too. I think that when we talk about the history in limited, we each get 15 minutes and we got to shut up. We got to decide which millions of things not to say. Some people feel that we haven't listed enough evils of NATO, and some people feel that we haven't listed enough evils of Russia. And yet every single evil I hear about, I agree with. I agree with all the evils of NATO, and I agree with all the evils of Russia. And I think too much we've been conditioned into sort of thinking like little prosecutors, like the world is a court. And like blame is a finite quantity, and blaming someone is somehow unblaming someone else, which is just weird to my mind. And if you say that, as I said in my opening remarks, you're immediately denounced as equating things. Whereas, of course, I spend my whole life pointing out that the United States government is far and away the world's leading weapons dealer. Russia is number 2, by the way. That the United States is far and away the leading war maker. That do the body count. The piles in Washington, D.C. are higher than everybody else has put together. We can go through this. It just doesn't contribute one speck of intelligence on this criminal war making by Russia that everyone feels obliged to say, well, I oppose it, but, well, I don't support it, but, you know, so there was a moment when Russia was mocking the idea that it was going to invade, when Russia was aiding refugees, when Russia was talking about the rule of law, which it hasn't done much to support for a long, long time, and had the world moving on its side. And people who denounced NATO's wars, as everyone should, mocking the idea that Russia was going to invade and so forth. That was a moment to use the things we have barely touched on, the tools of nonviolence, rather than war, you know, which again is not to even hint at the idea that the war need never have happened if NATO or Ukraine or the United States had behaved the least bit wisely or decently. And so I think we have to sort of drop this notion that's in the back of everyone's head that blame is something finite. It really isn't. It goes everywhere.
Thank you, David. Lindsey?
Yes, thanks for the questions. I mean, just a couple of points. And one is to echo what David said, that I don't think, you know, I don't think anybody who's spoken here is defending in any way what the US is doing or what NATO's doing. I think exactly the opposite. I spend nearly all my time opposing my own government and mainly the American government, which it's so closely tied to. But, you know, I think when we look at these questions of wars, we have to look at them not simply as what's wrong with our government. We also have to look at the wider politics. And certainly in my case, in the case of my organization, we didn't say with Afghanistan, we're opposing what America and Britain does because we support the Taliban. We didn't say over Iraq, it's because we support Saddam Hussein. People had a whole range of different views on these politics and all sorts of other things. We said we oppose the war because it is an imperialist war. The war is completely wrong. We can't justify it. That doesn't mean we justify everything that the supposed enemy does. And I feel that it's a mistake, really, over the Russia question. And, you know, Derek has said, look, I don't agree with Putin's war. You know, I can't support what Putin's doing. Well, that's what I think. Now, we may have different analyses about where we got there or why it's being framed in this kind of way, and I absolutely accept that Russia see NATO expansion as a major threat, and this is one of the issues that obviously gives Putin support in Russia, apart from anything else, that people feel that this is a threat from the West. It's also a threat of fascism. But I think we've got to be very clear here. If we want to build a movement, we can't start by saying, okay, we're the anti-war movement in the NATO countries and we support Russia. I just think that's wrong. I think it's wrong in intellectually, and I think it's wrong practically to actually do it. I do actually think the point, I agree again with David, the point that Wolfgang made, which is that if Russia supports the ceasefire, we should say, okay, that should be the end of sanctions. I mean, I think I've never supported the sanctions. I think they're very damaging to the people of Russia. And actually, of course, what we're finding is they're very, very damaging to the people of all sorts of other countries because of the consequences of them in terms of food shortages and fuel shortages and so on. So I think we can find areas of agreement, but I certainly don't feel we can find agreement over what I think is quite a fundamental issue, this question of whether or not we do think the invasion was wrong. And just finally on Joan's point about, you know, the whole business and the economy and, you know, these things, as I think we're all aware, are very much linked. You know, the question of climate change, the question of economic crisis, the question of war. These are things that are very, very much linked, and we have to try to link them as much as we can. So I personally think this is, you know, I think the US is an imperialist country. I think actually Russia has certain imperialist characteristics, if you want to put it like that. It's certainly expansionist in terms of its views, certainly under Putin. But, you know, whether people agree with that or not, I definitely think we have to link the economic with the military, because they are completely linked, not just in terms of arms sales, which is a very important part of it, but in terms of the way in which economic competition becomes military competition. And that's what we're seeing around the world at the moment, particularly in relation to China. And that is a very, very dangerous moment for us.
Thank you. Paul?
Thank you. I like your comments, Lindsey and David, very, very much. And I would just put forth the proposition is that when we argue about blame, you know, how does blame get us to peace? And there's certainly, you know, there's enough blame to go around, and certainly that things are not black and white, not even by a long shot, and that things are happening on all sides. What we are running into is there's a slight distinction between, very slight, between anti-war and pro-peace. I mean, not taking sides all that firmly, and so that you're locked into one side or the other, and the only possible peace solution becomes either the defeat or overcoming the other side. We run into, I guess you may know this, what we run into a lot is confirmational bias. In other words, all you are looking for in terms of the discussion and the facts and whatever that have been put forth today is to confirm your own bias or the own position that you want to have. For example, if you're against the death penalty and somebody supports you, that validates you. If somebody's against you, that simply makes you more defensive and hardens your position in some way. And this confirmational bias, you know, winds up in the peace movement of polarizing it in all sorts of directions, you know, anti-NATO, anti-UN, anti-Russia, anti-United States, when the real question is, how do we get to peace in this particular situation, given that the blame is so foggy and all over the place? How do you get to peace? And then from that point of view, as I had started to talk about, is there is an organization and tied to some UN resolutions that are trying to produce departments or ministries of peace in countries, so that these ministries can have some sort of say in or influence as a precursor to the departments of defense, so that they when the government is being advised, on one hand it has a ministry that's going to talk. On the other hand, it'll have the Department of Defense, and at least it'll have some kind of informed position from which to go forward. Right now, it's totally unbalanced, totally unbalanced. And as I say, we have a high-level forum at the UN each year where we're trying to edge this forward, and maybe this might give it some traction in the long run.
Thank you, Ryan.
I think one aspect we've not covered very much is the question of what could an eventual peace settlement look like. It was interesting that quite early on in the war, Lord Dannatt, who was previously a CNC of British forces, British military, said that it may be necessary to think the unthinkable, and that would require an acceptance that Russia would keep some territory while withdrawing generally, would keep some territory of the Ukraine as the price for peace. In other words, the Ukraine would have to trade land for peace. The other thing that would be required would be an understanding about the security, future security of Ukraine itself. On the one hand, it would not join NATO. On the other hand, it would have its security and borders guaranteed by all the countries surrounding it, including Russia. There might need to be a United Nations peacekeeping force at certain points to help to signify that. So I think it may be necessary to think in terms of what each side would give up, what each side would gain in order to move towards realistic negotiated peace?
Thank
Thank you.
I think it's time to wind up because it's 8:30 and we had speakers and question answers. So we've been up and running for 2 hours. And I just like to conclude that in the peace movement, we are here to lead. So as many of your speakers and others have said, how we can, like uniting with each other, like having a bigger peace movement, and so many new ideas people have come up with. So let us try to negotiate those ideas. And the most important thing is, although we are in the midst of a war, energy and food crises, climate change crises, and so many inequality and etc. But the idea is not to lose hope. And that's why we are in the peace movement for, that we unite, we keep the hope, we keep the light on and carry on working. I think our work starts right from now. Thank you to all the distinguished speakers and the audience, and we will soon be meeting again. But before I go, the speakers, if you can let us have your presentations, because as I said, we are going to put it in the next newsletter. That'll be very helpful. And all the attendees and wonderful questions we have. Thank you very much and have a good evening or whatever time your part of the world is. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to you, Vijay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I appreciate being able to listen to you.
Yeah, take good care. Bye.
Okay.